Welcome to another one of our ENO8 Answers workshops. This is a topic we did. We've done this one before last year, and we had a lot of follow-up questions, and so it continues to come up in conversations with clients and prospective clients and founders that we talk to, as well as, for that matter, people in large enterprises that are working on new digital product development. So we're going to revisit the topic of, is your software project off the rails, and what are 5 things that you can do to fix it? And this happens a lot. So I think this is a topic that a lot of people out there can probably relate to. First, as we dive in, just a little bit of quick background on me. For those of you that are not familiar with me or haven't met before, my name's Jeff Francis. I'm one of the co-founders of ENO8. We're a Inc. 5000 digital innovation studio based in Dallas, Texas. And me personally, I've worked with startups and launched, more than 100 new digital products, probably several hundred, in fact. But so I've been doing this a long time, seen a lot, had a lot of successes, made some mistakes along the way that we've learned from. And so I'm really excited to do these ENO8 sessions because it's just an opportunity to share a lot of learnings from those different experiences and help others sort of navigate the path without making some of those similar mistakes that we've come across over the years. So having said all that, let's kind of jump in here. So you've got a problem project or a problem product development effort that is not going well. I'm sort of calling it going off the rails. And so when you see that happening, what are the things that you can do about that, right? How can you get it back on track again? So one of the very first things that I want to talk about is properly defining and communicating scope. You'd be surprised how much of product development related issues can be related or traced back to a lack of a scope, not a very clear scope, or the scope isn't well communicated to all the various stakeholders. And so let's talk about a few of those different elements for a moment. One is the scope even defined? Or is the scope floating around in someone or someone's head? And so one of the common phrases that you'll hear on this is that this is what we talked about, right? Referring to scope, right? And often what I'll see is if there's a project that is coming up against timeline or budget constraints, the scope hasn't been defined, and so the scope just continues to evolve, change, and grow, and there's nothing to manage to. And so the problem with not having a real clear scope is you have no way of ensuring that everyone is on the same page. You have no clear target to hit, right? And the scope a lot of times will stay very conceptual instead of very specific, right? So you can think of like a big feature, but then the details of what is inside that feature are really the only way for you to understand how much effort, time, budget are going to be required to complete that. And so I think one of the very first stops on the train, if you're trying to get this back on track, is to go to the source of what is your scope, right? What are you considering sort of your source of truth for what defines the scope of what we're trying to do? Second would be make sure that everyone involved, the stakeholders, are all on the same page and agree that that is the scope, right? And then your project manager on the effort can then have something to manage to. And so the instructions to them will be, if it's not part of this scope, we don't do it, or we have to raise it as an escalation to get an approval. And so if you're working with a partner, a lot of times that can show itself as like a change request, right? I think change requests a lot of times get a bad rap because they get interpreted as just ways to increase the budget. But really, change requests can be a very powerful mechanism for ensuring that you're managing to some sort of guideline. So if you define the scope, and anytime the scope changes, even if it won't affect the timeline or budget, you're approving some sort of a change request, it's a really great way to keep everything tight. And so even if it's an in-house product team and you've got to change a scope, I would document that. And it doesn't have to be like a contract like it would be if you're working with a partner, but maybe it could be in the form of like a decision log or some sort of formal sign off that says, hey, the scope was this when we started, but we're changing it to this now. And so one last thing I'll mention on this is in the context of Agile, right, or Scrum, a lot of folks say that there's no defined scope. It's very iterative. And while I agree with that in some part, you still have to have some sort of a roadmap or some kind of milestones or targets to shoot for in the real world. In the real world, you have budgets, you have money that has to be invested, you have time, you have resources. You can't just agile yourself in circles forever. And so it's really important that you have some sort of defined roadmap with some sort of defined goals, targets, or objectives, and you're managing your scope towards those milestones or those objectives. So just a couple of things to keep in mind on scope. That's a big, important one. That's the reason why I chose to talk about that one as number one. The second one here, I kind of call this like check your premise. Sometimes when you start off on a journey to build a new product or to massively change or update an existing product, you do that with a certain set of goals, objectives, or underlying assumptions. And so when a product development effort gets off track, a lot of times it could be really helpful to stop and kind of check your original premise. Like, why did we start out on this journey in the first place? What were our original goals? What were we hoping to achieve? And also, what was our original plan of attack, right? Like we made decisions on how we were going to build it, what team we were going to use to build it. We did evaluations on buy versus build. There's all these different things that happen at the beginning when you're first starting out. And a lot of times it's easy to get really so focused on the day-to-day, what are we working on right now during this sprint? Is this sprint on track? That you can lose track of your original goals and your original premise behind decisions that you've already made. So I think backing up, revisiting, and making sure that your original assumptions and decisions are still sound. One example on this that I've talked about before that I think is pretty useful is we had worked with a client years ago where they were doing a pretty large, complex product development effort, and we kind of came in a little bit late. And a decision had been made to use an off-the-shelf product, right? Because they thought that could get them a long way down the road without having to do a lot of custom development. But when that happened with the party, it got really bogged down, and there was this feeling of running in circles. So they would think things have been resolved, and then issues would still show up, or a feature got identified that needed to be incorporated, and it just couldn't quite get to the finish line. Every time you think you're almost there, you discover there's more that has to be done. And so some of that was the first point I talked about making sure that your scope is clear. The second was we had to revisit the premise of this buy decision for using this product that had already been built and customizing around it rather than sort of custom developing the entire solution. In that particular case, someone had to ask the hard question of, should we still be committed to this path? And ultimately, they made the decision that that's not the right path. We're not going to get there. We're going to keep running in circles, or it's going to be extremely expensive to plug the gap between where that existing product gets us and where we need to be. And so things change. You learn more things. You get more insight, better understanding. Things change, and accept that. But the best way to understand it is to first check your original premise and then check it against where you're at right now and make sure those things still stand. Number 3 is assess roles and skills. A lot of this relates to, do I have the right team in place? Oftentimes in smaller companies, especially startups, you start with a really small team where a lot of the players are having to wear multiple hats. And sometimes the result is they're playing out of position, right? So maybe, as an example, you have a really strong developer that's a great developer, but they're having to wear the hat of an architect or a DevOps person, right? And so maybe they can do those things to a certain extent, but that's not really their strength or their skill. You may have a designer that's great visual designer, but they're not real great from a sort of more UX strategy, product strategy, holistic user experience standpoint, right? And so sometimes you need to back up and look at your current team, make sure you have all the roles covered, make sure you have people who are capable of covering those different roles. And if you have gaps, you got to have an answer for it. Don't just kick the can down the road. A big one that I see here often is in the areas of product management and project management, especially in small teams. There's sometimes a tendency to allocate the budget and resources more towards development time or development capacity than product management or project management or maybe even testing. So these roles are really important. And I'm not saying you have to have a different person for every single one of these roles, but you have to make sure that it's clear on who is covering those different responsibilities and ensuring that they actually have the right skill set to be able to cover those responsibilities. So take a real clear look at what are the different roles, what are the different things that need to be done, who's covering those, and make sure that's really clear. You got the right people, they've got the right capabilities, and that they've been communicated that those are the different roles that they're responsible for. If you guys want more details on what are the roles, like what are the different players on a successful team, both in sort of a small product development effort or in more of a scaled agile environment, reach out to me and I can give you more specific information on that and kind of give you some guidance on maybe what that looks like at those different stages. So there's some thoughts on assessing roles and skills. Next is checking expectations. This is another big gap. This one shows up all the time. Sometimes because the scope isn't clear. Sometimes the scope is clear, but there's just unrealistic expectations. So maybe your project is progressing just as it should be, or maybe it's doing really well, but the perception is that it is not proceeding very well, right? That tells me there's an expectation gap. I've seen this a lot where we have a very high-performing team that is operating at a high velocity and they're completing their sprints and they're moving tickets and they're closing points, but then stakeholders are still not happy, right? So that's not fair to the developers. It's also not fair to the stakeholders, right? Because if those expectations are not clear, no one's going to be happy. So one, making sure expectations are clear, making sure they're documented. Conversations don't work in this world, right? It only becomes real once it's written down and everybody's sort of signed off on it, right? So check your expectations and make sure that the timelines are reasonable. Sometimes you'll see timelines are set by someone who actually isn't really involved in the actual engineering or the development work, right? So maybe it's an executive, maybe it's a founder who's not part of the product development team, and they're setting timelines based on business objectives, but they're not setting timelines based on what's the capacity and capabilities of the team, right? So how would you deal with that? First, you got to get clear on what those expectations are, being clear on what your actual velocity and your capacity for your team is, and then figure out, like, what can you do to close the gap? Sometimes it's just clarifying expectations. Sometimes it is trimming down scope. Sometimes it's adding bandwidth to the team, right? There's other ways you can close that gap, but those are some good examples is clarifying expectations, trimming scope, or expanding the capacity of the team are some of the big ones. Revisiting the timeline again, who was the one that established the timeline, and then is that timeline clear, right? Again, make sure it's documented. I can't stress that enough. It comes up when you're talking about scope. It comes when you're talking about like deliverables, timelines, roadmap, unless it's in a document and that document's getting shared with people. And I'll take it one step further. And unless someone is signing off on it to say, I've read this and I approve it, you're not truly on the same page yet. So it may sound a little bit ticky-tacky or extreme, but those extra steps there help make sure that everybody is totally on the same page. And before I move on to the next point, one thing that I'd like you to keep in mind on expectations, specifically around timeline, is you want to make sure that your timeline has really accounted for all the different things that need to occur. So a common mistake here is that the estimated timeline for completing a certain phase or a certain checkpoint is based purely on the development effort for the different tickets or the scope that's been defined. So we've got this body of work, we estimated it, and then we sort of divided how much of our development capacity by how much work needs to be done. So that only paints part of the picture, and it's where people get in a lot of trouble. They think that just doing the development effort equals getting to your timeline. But the problem with that is it doesn't account for anything that may be not accounted for, like surprises. Like if your estimates are relying on everything to go perfectly, you're already going to be late, right? Because there's always going to be unknowns. There's always going to be challenges that are going to come up. If your plan doesn't have some sort of thoughtful allocation for the unknown or challenges that we're not aware of yet, you're already going to be late. I can tell you that. Other things that you need to account for is like a code freeze time, or like a feature complete time, where you are not planning to be doing feature development, but you're planning to be doing sort of polish work, cleanup, bug fixes, getting feedback from the testing team. You need something in your plan for that. You also need a plan for your regression testing. So what is the test plan? Whoever's responsible for quality assurance, do they have a clear plan for here's how I'm going to ensure the quality of the product before we release it? And so they may require like a full front to end regression test, right? So do they have test cases? Do they have something clear there for how they're going to conduct that regression test? How long are they going to need in order to run that regression test? And then you're going to need to account some time for addressing the issues that are unearthed during that testing phase. So make sure you've got that in your plan. Also, retesting. So let's say you do user acceptance testing. Your QA team does their regressive testing. You're going to get feedback. You're going to identify stuff that needs to be assessed. So things that have to be addressed before we release, things that can wait. You're going to have to go through that exercise and then actually address the things that you've identified as being really critical. And then once you fix those, there's going to be another step on the other side of it to help retest or reconfirm that it's ready to go. So do you have that in your plan? So think through those things. I'll just kind of recap those. You have your QA, your testing plan, code freeze, user acceptance testing, getting feedback from those users, retesting again after you've addressed it. And then the last part I'll mention is sort of your release process, right? Like what's your actual process once you have this sort of internal go in order to push it to production? How long is it going to take you to execute on that? So think about those things as you're assessing your timeline, right? And then the last point that I'll talk about is, I call this kind of checking your process stickiness. So a couple thoughts on this. One is, do you even have the basics of your process nailed down? The second part of it is, how consistently are you following that process? So let's start with, if you don't have a clear process that is really ad hoc, you probably need to take a look at that. And what I'm talking about there are mainly the repetitive ceremonies that are associated with ongoing product development. And so this could be things like, are you sticking to a very strict sprint schedule? For instance, we tend to like to run in 2-week sprints. And so are you sticking to that 2-week cycle? Or are your sprints kind of stretching? Sometimes they're 2 weeks, sometimes they're 3 weeks, sometimes they're 2.5 weeks. If we get to the end of the sprint and we're waiting to test 2 or 3 more tickets, do we wait till tomorrow to close the sprint? Those are kind of things where I would look at that to make sure you're staying really strict on your sprint schedule. One of the benefits of staying to a strict sprint schedule is that you can actually accurately gauge velocity and productivity of your team and judging where problems are coming up really quickly inside the sprint. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another one is, are you doing daily stand-ups, right? Like they could be short, or are we checking in every day? And is everyone who's involved with the development effort on the sprint call? Like sometimes you'll see that people can't show up every day, so they'll pop in once, twice a week. I really want to encourage you that if you have a role to play and you're on the team, you need to be on the daily stand-up every day, especially the developers. So especially if your name is on a ticket, for instance, right? So are you sticking to a strict sprint schedule? Are you doing daily stand-ups? Do you have a recurring process for grooming your backlog and estimating effort on that backlog and planning your sprints and prioritizing with the product owner. I've seen trouble come up when you don't have a recurring schedule and it's not happening like clockwork. So meetings get missed. It's not on the recurring calendar, so people sometimes can't show up, and so sometimes you can't get connected. The backlog quality degrades, and then your sprint quality degrades next as a result. So looking at your processes that you have in place, there's a lot more to this. I could talk for probably a whole session just on this particular point, but like revisit, make sure that you have a clear process, whatever that might be, and then check, are you sticking to that process with great discipline? And if either one of those answers is no, immediately try to figure out what you got to do to tighten that up, right? And then the other part of that is just ensuring the accountability around adhering to the process. So that's the points that I wanted to cover for today. I'll open up to Q&A and see, and I should have said something a little bit earlier, guys, but if you have questions, throw them into the Q&A window. I'd love to pick those up and talk about them. Or if you have any feedback on any of the points that I've already talked about so far, feel free to throw those in the Q&A window as well. I think, as usual, we try to collate a few questions that we get offline prior to these so that we can kind of answer some of the ones that come up on the topic. I think, Jordan, you just sent me a message here in the chat. Let me read this one off. So how do I know if my project is starting to get off track? What should I be looking for? Yeah, this is a good question. So in essence, what you're saying is maybe it's off track, maybe it's not, but how do I know what I look for? So I think some of the things I would look for is I start at the very basic level of looking at the sprint that we have right now. Are we closing the items in the sprint? So it's sort of a quick first check. The current sprint that we have, is everything estimated? Is everything appropriately sized for the sprint? Meaning we have a certain amount of capacity, we can close X number of points with the current team. How many points do we have in the sprint? If my velocity is that I can close 100 points in a sprint, but I've got 200 points planned for the sprint, there's automatically a red flag. I need to dig into that, understand what's going on. So I like to start sort of at the sprint level and see, are we within the sprint boxes, are we accomplishing what we say we want to? And then my next stop is I would zoom out and go, okay, bigger picture, what's my product roadmap and what are my checkpoints? Either that could be a release, that could be a version, that could be some sort of a launch date, maybe if it's a new product, but what's my target, right? What's the target I'm aiming for? And how clear am I on where I stand in my progress towards that that target right now? And what I mean by that is, if I have a launch date in 90 days from now, what data am I looking at in order to know whether I'm on track or off track, right? And then you can also think about one of the points that I mentioned a little bit earlier in the workshop here about, have you planned time properly for your user acceptance testing and your regression testing and the development time that you're still assuming is when you're feature complete, right? Where you're not implementing features, but you're bug fixing and polishing and cleaning stuff up. So to recap, I would sort of start at the sprint level. I would see how we are doing within those sprints. Do we seem really disciplined? Do we seem like we're hitting our target for each of the individual sprints? And then next, I'm going to zoom out and look at our roadmap. Do we have clear definition on what our targets are? And then the next part that we'll probably look at there is, if I'm representing bodies of work that need to be done on that roadmap, have I quantified in some way what the effort and time needed for each of those bodies of work would be, right? And maybe you're breaking them down by epics. So how do you know how big that epic is? Is it that you have full definition of scope and then you've estimated it? That would be great if you have that. But oftentimes, the further out, the less fuzzy, the more fuzzy the requirements are. And so when you have these epics or these sort of modules of work to complete, and they're a little bit further out on your roadmap, what usually happens is you don't have full definition of what the scope is. And that could come in the form of maybe user stories or backlog tickets. Design assets that you need for that work would be another one. So if you don't have all of that ready, then you're not going to have a total picture of what the scope is. So how are you accounting for the scope? And whether it's right or whether it's wrong, or whether it's really accurate or not very accurate, is less important than having some logic behind how am I defining the placeholder of effort and time needed for each of those modules, epics, or word bodies. So hope that helps, guys. Let's see. I don't see any other questions coming in. So I'll give one more minute here. If y'all have any other questions, throw them in the chat. I'm going to mention one other thing before we wrap up for today, because we're getting pretty close on time. If you have questions on this topic that we did today, or even other related topics, maybe it's a past ENO8 answers, or it's just something that you would like our input on, feel free to email us at info@eno8.com. It's ENO and the number 8.com, like there on the slide. Or I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. Feel free to direct message me on LinkedIn. And we'd love to help out any way that we can if you have questions. One other thought there is we create some pretty good stuff on the general topics surrounding digital innovation and product development. So if you'd like to get on our newsletter, we send that out once a month. It's got a lot of good stuff in there. We try to provide a lot of education information. So email us there. We can get you added to the newsletter, or I think you can go to our website and sign up. And then we also have a weekly email that goes out on one of these topics, where we just try to pick up a topic that we've been talking about a lot, or we hear a lot about, and we just kind of give our insights on that. So feel free to message us. We'd love to take those. Let's see here. I've got a couple more questions. So let's see. Do you have any suggestions on tracking skill sets, levels, project milestone, resources, and roadmaps in one system? Yes and no. I think I know where this type of question comes from. Our stack, we typically use the Atlassian suite for most of our stuff as it relates to work on the product during the development phase. The main player there is Jira. We're pretty happy with it. I think it's not terrific on is when you're looking at broad roadmap planning. Like, so if you think of, like, I'm a product owner or I'm a founder and I'm trying to communicate broad roadmap type of concepts to investors or executives, Jira is not the best for that. They do have a roadmap feature in there where you can slot in epics and kind of show like what the mapping of those epics to future sprints would be. That might get it there. I would encourage you, like, I'm the type of personality, I can get caught up on the tool, right? I know that about myself. And so I would encourage you to maybe be careful to get focused on the right tool to do it versus it getting done. So an example for me where I could break that pattern is if I'm trying to get to high level roadmap, man, one tool that works really great for me is just good old fashioned Google Sheet. Like a Google Sheet with, here's the different bodies of work or the different major things that we need to account for. And I put columns for the date ending of the sprint schedules. And then, where are we for each of those modules, right? And then where are we going to be working on them? That works pretty good just to rough it in. And then you could map that into Jira to create your epics if you don't have those, and then create the tickets that relate to those different epics. But that's probably a really long-winded answer, but the Atlassian Suite's a pretty good place to start, paired with Confluence. Confluence has a lot of really good templates for a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about as well. I have another question here. Any tips on how to reset with a project manager when you're off the rails? How I would approach that depends on how far off the rails things are and how loud the alarm bells are going off. If it is really bad, I would hit the pause button. Like, stop everything. Stop the conveyor belt, pause everyone, and regroup and make sure our plan is sound and we know where we're at. a tendency for teams is that once they have a team working on things and they know things are going poorly, they become very afraid to stop work and go focus their energy on getting clarity. And the result is they never get clarity. They don't ever get it fixed, and they continue to burn money. And a lot of times they find out that they're not even landing the airplane at the right airport, right? So I think depending on how severe it is, you may want to hit the pause button. And we've written about this before. I think we've actually, we may have even done an ENO8 answers on pause concept. But if you want more on that, I think we got a blog post or an article on it we can share. So just email us and we can send that to you. But just generally, how do you reset with a project manager? I think if you're not the project manager and you're wanting to reset with the PM, I think where I would personally start is do a product review meeting, right? And that meeting, I would start with sort of the high level stuff, like where are we right now, right? Where do you think we are on sort of the triple constraints, like the timeline, the budget, and scope? Like, are we red, yellow, or green on each of those things, right? I would start high level like that. Next, I would start with, okay, can you show me our roadmap? Show me where we are today, right? And so start at that high level and drill down. And what I would like to, if that was me, what I would focus on is trying to ask questions that help me to understand how confident I should be in the answers. So for instance, if I hear we're totally on track, everything's good, then my next question will be like, that's awesome. How do you know that? What are you looking at in order to have that level of confidence? So hopefully what you'll see when you ask that question is, well, here's the roadmap, here's the different things we've identified, and then here's the details of how we've defined each one of those. Here's the estimates that I've assigned to all of those, and here's how we're tracking against that so far, right? So I think focus on trying to understand how they're arriving at their answer is way more important than what their actual answer is, if that makes sense. And I think a question came from Rosalie. Rosalie, if you would, let me know if that answered your question, or if you'd like me to go in a little more detail on that. But it's a really good question, I think. Let's see here. So give it a couple more minutes because we got a couple of others coming in, and I'll see if we get a response on if I've covered that question thoroughly enough. It's a good one, by the way. All right. I think we're going to assume that we're good on that. So, terrific. I think we're a few minutes over, but I appreciate you guys joining today. Hopefully this was valuable. And, yeah, it said, okay, great. Good. Okay. I got the message. Thanks. I'm glad that helped. So, yeah, thank you guys for joining today. I hope this helped a lot. As I mentioned earlier, we'd love to help. So reach out to us if you have any questions or anything you think we could assist with, and give some feedback on the episode today. If you liked it, if you hated it, we'd love to hear back, feedback either way, and how we could improve it in sort of future versions of these. So again, thanks for joining. Really appreciate it, and hope to see you on one of our future episodes. Thank you guys.